Look, I'm not a writer. I'm a doctor who's seen too much blood. But what happened in London in 1889? That wasn't just a case, it was the beginning of the end. Pay attention, boss, because if you're listening to this, it's because the official version you know, is a damn lie. London was a graveyard that night. The fog was so thick you could taste the coal, and the misery in the air. Inside 221B, Baker Street, the silence was biting. Sherlock Holmes was hunched over in his chair, eyes sunken, looking like a ghost haunting his own apartment. He wasn't looking for clues. He was waiting for a nightmare to walk through the door. Trust me, boss, he knew it was coming. Then came the knock. Violent. Desperate. Dr. James Mortimer practically fell into the room. This guy wasn't just scared, he was shattered. He looked like he'd seen the bottom of a grave, and something had blinked back at him. He pulled out this old, yellowed manuscript from 1742. The Baskerville Legend. Holmes. Mortimer's voice was a jagged whisper. I'm not here for a detective. I'm here because the devil has come to collect a debt. He started reading that cursed story. About Hugo Baskerville, a man so vile he sold his soul to hunt a girl across the moor, only to have his throat ripped out by a creature that shouldn't exist. A hound, from hell. You see, boss, some debts are paid in blood, and some are paid in souls. Holmes let out a cold, dry laugh. Fairy tales, Mortimer. People die. They don't get cursed by ghost dogs. But Mortimer didn't laugh back. He leaned in, his face ghostly under the flickering lamp. Sir Charles Baskerville didn't just die, Holmes. The papers say heart failure. But I saw him. I saw his face before they cleaned him up. He wasn't just dead, he was horrified. His features were melted into a scream that never made it out of his throat. His eyes. Boss, his eyes were blown out, from pure, unadulterated, terror. The room felt like it dropped 10 degrees. Holmes's cigarette smoke swirled around us like gray snakes. The tracks, Mortimer. Give me the facts, not the ghost stories. Mortimer's hands shook as he gripped his cane. Charles was crawling, Holmes. Dragging himself through the mud in his final moments. And 50 yards away from his body, where no man or beast should have been. Footprints. I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Mortimer looked at me with eyes full of literal madness. Not footprints, Watson. Paw prints. Huge. Deep. Claw marks carved into the earth like the thing weighed 1,000 pounds. It wasn't a dog. It was a monster. Suddenly, the lamp flared and died. We were plunged into pitch black. And in that darkness, I heard it. Not from the street. From inside the room. A heavy, wet, guttural breathing. The smell of rotting meat and sulfur filled my lungs. Can you smell it too, boss? That's the scent of death. I struck a match, my fingers trembling so hard I almost dropped it. The light flickered on for a second. Mortimer was gone. The chair was empty. The door was still bolted from the inside. Holmes. Where the hell did he go? I yelled. Holmes was standing by the window, staring into the fog. He didn't look surprised. He looked hungry, like he'd been waiting for this fight his whole life. Mortimer didn't leave, Watson. He ran. He saw what was standing right behind you. I spun around to the mirror. For one split second, before the match burned my fingers and went out, I saw it. A shadow. Towering. With jagged ears, and two glowing, sickly green eyes, staring back at me from the darkness. "Check your revolver, Watson," Holmes said, his voice flat and terrifyingly calm. "Logic is a luxury we can't afford anymore. Tomorrow, we go to Dartmoor. We're going to find out if that hound bleeds, or if we do. Get ready, boss, because we're going to a place where the sun never shines, and the fog never leaves." The train ride to Devon felt like a one-way trip to a funeral. The further we got from London, the more the world seemed to lose its color. Gray skies, gray fields, and a silence that felt heavy enough to crush your lungs. Sherlock Holmes hasn't said a word for hours. He's just staring out the window, watching the rain wash away civilization. Are you still with me, boss? Because where we're going, your mind is the first thing you'll lose. We arrived at the edge of the moor just as the sun was dying. A bleak, jagged landscape opened up before us, miles of treacherous mud and ancient stone. Our driver, a man with a face as hard as the granite around us, pointed his whip toward the horizon. "A prisoner escaped from Princetown 2 days ago," he said, his voice like gravel. "A murderer named Selden. Keep your doors locked, and your eyes open. A murderer on the loose, and a ghost hound in the fog. Hell of a welcome, right, boss?" Then, we saw it. Baskerville Hall. It stood there like a giant tombstone. Two thin, high towers rising into the mist, windows that looked like hollow eye sockets. The ivy crawling up the walls looked like veins on a dead man's hand. We were met at the door by Barrymore, the butler. He was a tall, pale shadow of a man, with a black beard that hid any hint of a smile. His wife stood behind him, her eyes red, like she'd been crying for a century. "Welcome home, Sir Henry," Barrymore said, but his voice didn't sound like a welcome. It sounded like a warning. That night, the house felt alive. The wind howled through the chimneys, making sounds that resembled human screams. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fireplace in my room, my revolver on the table, waiting. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. Click, click, click. Someone was walking in the corridor. I grabbed my candle and stepped out. The hallway was a tunnel of darkness. I followed the sound to the far end, near the gallery of the Baskerville ancestors. I saw a light. A single candle flame flickering in the dark. It was Barrymore. He was standing by a window, holding the candle against the glass, staring out into the pitch-black moor. He wasn't moving. He was signaling. Waiting for something, or someone, out there in the mud. Can you feel the tension, boss? The people who are supposed to protect this house, are the ones we should fear the most. Suddenly, from deep within the moor, a sound tore through the night. It started as a low rumble, and rose into a high, agonizing shriek. It wasn't the wind. It was the same sound Mortimer described. The sound of a beast that's been hungry for 200 years. Barrymore's candle went out. He turned around, and for a second, the moonlight hit his face. He wasn't scared. He was smiling. "What was that sound, Barrymore?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his eyes cold and empty. "It's just the moor, Dr. Watson. The mud shifts, the wind blows, and the legends grow." He walked past me without another word, leaving me alone in the dark. I went back to my room, but I didn't go to bed. I looked out the window, and I swear to you, boss, out there, in the middle of the great grim Penmire, I saw a light. A small, glowing dot, answering Barrymore's signal. And right next to that light, two massive, green eyes, blinking in the dark. I looked for Holmes. His room was empty. His bed hadn't been slept in. He was gone. Out there, in the fog, with a murderer and a monster. The sun didn't rise the next morning, it just turned the fog into a thick, suffocating blanket of gray. Sherlock Holmes is still missing. No note. No tracks. Just an empty room and a cold fireplace. It's just me, Sir Henry, and a house full of secrets that want us dead. Are you holding your breath, boss? Because in this place, breathing is a luxury. I decided to head out into the moor. I needed answers, and the house was starting to feel like a cage. As I walked, the ground beneath my boots changed. The grass gave way to the great grim Penmire, a vast, bubbling swamp that can swallow a horse in seconds. One wrong step, and you're gone. Forever. Suddenly, I saw a figure in the distance. A man. He was crouching over something in the mud. I pulled my revolver, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was Stapleton, the naturalist who lives nearby. His face twisted into a weird, jagged grin. "Careful, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice thin and sharp. "The mire is hungry today." He pointed to a spot a few yards away. A pony was sinking into the black mud, screaming, its eyes rolling back in terror until the slime covered its nostrils. Glub, glub. Then, silence. "That's how the hound takes them," Stapleton whispered. "It doesn't just kill. It watches you drown." I didn't like the way he said that, boss. He sounded proud. Later that evening, I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I followed a trail of broken branches, leading deep into the heart of the rocks. The wind was screaming, carrying that same, low, guttural growl I heard in London. I reached a stone hut, an old, ruined shelter from a forgotten age. Inside, I found something that made my blood turn to ice. A scrap of cloth. It was from Holmes's coat. And next to it, a tin of food, half eaten. Holmes was here. He was hiding from me. Why, boss? Why would my best friend, my partner, be lurking in the shadows like a criminal? Then, I heard a scream. A long, high-pitched, soul-shattering shriek. It came from the cliffs above the mire. I ran, my boots slipping in the red mud, the fog clawing at my face. I reached the edge of the ravine, and I saw it. A body. Smashed against the jagged rocks below. He was wearing a suit I recognized. "Sir Henry!" I yelled, my voice cracking. I scrambled down the slope, my hands shaking so hard I could barely move. I turned the body over. The face was gone. Literally torn off. But wait, boss, look closer. This wasn't Sir Henry. It was Selden, the escaped murderer. He was wearing Sir Henry's old clothes. The hound didn't want a criminal, it wanted a Baskerville. And it realized its mistake, too late. I looked up, and there, on the peak of the cliff, stood a silhouette. A tall, thin man, silhouetted against the moonlight. He was watching me. He didn't move. He didn't help. He just stood there, like a vulture waiting for the rest of the meal. "Holmes," I whispered. The figure turned, and for a second, I saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a detective. They were cold, calculated, and filled with a darkness I'd never seen before. He didn't say a word. He just stepped back into the fog, and vanished. I'm sitting here now, by Selden's mutilated corpse, and I'm starting to realize something, boss. The hound is real. The curse is real. But the most dangerous thing on this moor, might be the man I trusted with my life. I spent the night shivering next to Selden's corpse, waiting for a monster that never showed. At dawn, I dragged myself back to Baskerville Hall, my mind a mess of shadows and suspicion. Sherlock Holmes is playing a game, and I'm just a pawn on a board made of mud and bones. You still following me, boss? Because this is where the puzzle pieces start to cut like glass. I walked into the dining hall, and there he was. Sherlock Holmes. Sitting there, clean, calm, sipping tea as if he hadn't spent the night lurking in a stone hut like a scavenger. "You look terrible, Watson," he said, his voice as sharp as a razor. No apology. No explanation. "I saw you on the cliff, Holmes." I snapped, slamming my fist on the table. "I saw that poor devil Selden with his face torn off. Why are you hiding? Whose side are you on?" Holmes set his cup down, slowly. He leaned in, his eyes drilling into mine. "I'm on the side of the truth, Watson. And the truth is, we aren't just hunting a dog. We're hunting a family secret that's been rotting for centuries." He pulled a small, blood-stained photograph from his pocket. It was a portrait of Hugo Baskerville, the original sinner. "Look at the eyes, boss," Holmes whispered, pointing at the faded image. I looked, and my heart skipped a beat. Hugo's eyes, cold, tilted, and filled with a hidden malice, were identical to someone we'd just met. Stapleton. The naturalist. The neighbor isn't a neighbor at all. He's a Baskerville. A forgotten branch of the family tree, coming back to claim the inheritance with a beast he's been breeding in the heart of the mire. But the shock didn't stop there. We heard a scream from the upstairs hallway. Not a man's scream, but a woman's. We ran. Holmes leading the way with a speed that was almost supernatural. We kicked open the door to Stapleton's house, and the smell hit us first. Not the smell of a home, but the smell of a cage. In the back room, we found Beryl Stapleton. The woman we thought was his sister. She was tied to a pillar, her face bruised, her mouth gagged with a piece of rough burlap. But it was what was behind her that made me pull my revolver. A massive, iron collar, bolted to the wall. And on the floor, scraps of raw, glowing meat. Phosphorescent paint. "That's how he does it, boss," Holmes muttered, his voice filled with a disgusted fascination. He coats the beast in phosphorus to make it look like a demon. It's not a ghost, it's a science experiment gone wrong. Suddenly, we heard it. A sound that made the floorboards vibrate. A heavy, metallic clank. The collar was empty. The beast was out. And it was headed straight for the hull. "Sir Henry!" I shouted. We ran out into the night, but the fog had returned, thicker than ever. We couldn't see our own hands. But we could hear. The sound of massive paws hitting the wet earth, thump, thump, thump. Coming closer. Holmes grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Don't fire until you see its eyes, Watson. If you miss, we're both going into the mud." And then, out of the gray void, it appeared. It wasn't just a dog. It was a nightmare draped in fire. Its eyes burned with a sickly green light, and its jaws were dripping with a glowing, toxic foam. It didn't bark. It just lunged. I fired. Once. Twice. But the beast didn't stop. It was like shooting at a cloud of smoke. It knocked me to the ground, its breath smelling like a chemical fire. I felt its teeth graze my throat, cold, sharp, and final. "Holmes." I choked out. But Holmes wasn't looking at the dog. He was looking past it, into the fog, at the figure holding a whistle. Stapleton was watching his creation finish us off. And he was laughing. The weight of the beast was crushing my chest. I could feel the cold, glowing foam from its jaws dripping onto my neck. It didn't feel like fur, it felt like touching a corpse that was still burning. I looked into those green eyes, and for a second, I didn't see an animal. I saw pure, calculated, hate. "Are you sweating yet, boss?" Because I was certain, this was my last breath. Crack. A shot rang out, but it wasn't mine. The beast shrieked, a sound so high it probably shattered the windows of the hull. It rolled off me, thrashing in the mud, its glowing skin flickering like a dying light bulb. I looked up, and there was Holmes. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a heavy, iron cane, and his face was twisted in a snarl that looked more savage than the hound itself. "Get up, Watson," he roared. "It's not dead. The phosphorus is protecting it." The beast scrambled to its feet. It was bleeding, but the blood was glowing too, leaving a trail of neon green on the black mud. It didn't attack us again. It turned, and vanished back into the fog. Why? Because it heard a whistle. A low, sharp frequency that only a killer could produce. "Stapleton." I gasped, clutching my throat. "He's calling it back." "No," Holmes whispered, his eyes fixed on the moving fog. "He's calling it to the mire. He's leading us into the trap." We ran. Every step was a gamble. The ground beneath us was vibrating, the great Grimpen mire was waking up. The fog was so thick I could hear Holmes's footsteps, but I couldn't see him. I was alone in a world of gray, and then I saw the lights. Hundreds of small, glowing spots in the mud. The beast had stepped everywhere, marking the safe path with its toxic blood. "Follow the glow, boss," I told myself. "Follow the death." We reached the center of the swamp, an island of solid rock surrounded by a sea of black, bubbling slime. And there stood Stapleton. He was holding a lantern, and next to him, the beast was sitting, panting, its glow fading as the chemical fire burned out. "You should have stayed in London, Mr. Holmes," Stapleton called out, his voice echoing off the rocks. "In the city, you're a genius. But out here, you're just meat." He raised the lantern, and then, he did something I'll never forget. He smashed the glass on the rock. The oil ignited, and in the sudden burst of fire, I saw the truth. There wasn't just one hound. There were shadows, dozens of them, moving in the fog. Stapleton hadn't just bred a monster, he'd created a pack. "The legend only mentions one," Stapleton laughed, a sound of pure insanity. "But history is written by the survivors." Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me. I didn't fall. I sank. The mire grabbed my legs like cold, heavy hands. I looked at Holmes, but he wasn't moving to help me. He was staring at the pack of shadows, his hand reaching into his coat for something, a small, black bottle. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice eerily calm as the mud reached my waist. "Do you remember what I said about logic? Forget it. Sometimes, you have to become the monster to kill the monster." He uncorked the bottle, and the smell of sulfur hit me like a physical blow. Holmes began to pour the liquid over his own arms, his own face. And then, he struck a match. "Close your eyes, boss," I heard him whisper. "This isn't going to look like a rescue." The world exploded in blue flame. And through the smoke, I saw Sherlock Holmes, covered in fire, sprinting toward the pack with a scream that didn't sound human. The mud was at my chest now, cold, thick, and smelling of rot. Every time I struggled, the mire pulled harder, tasting my fear. But I couldn't even scream, staring at a sight that defied nature. Sherlock Holmes was a pillar of blue flame. The chemical he'd poured over himself reacted with the fog, a shimmering aura making him look like a vengeful spirit. "Are you seeing this, boss? This isn't the man from Baker Street. This is something else." The pack of hounds, twisted shadows Stapleton bred, hesitated. Even monsters know when they're looking at something more dangerous. Holmes didn't run like a man, he moved like a blur of fire. He lunged at the nearest beast, burning hands grabbing its throat. I heard the sizzle of fur, crack of bone, and a howl cut short by tearing flesh. "Is this what you wanted, Stapleton?" Holmes's voice echoed, distorted and metallic through flames. "You wanted a demon. Well, here I am." Stapleton stepped back, arrogance dying in his eyes. He blew his whistle, a frantic scream for his pets. But the hounds were scattering. Predators realizing they'd become prey. They vanished into fog, leaving Stapleton alone on the rock, with a burning detective closing in. But I was still sinking, boss. The mud touched my chin. My breath came in short gasps. "Holmes." I choked out, barely a whisper. He didn't look back. Locked in a dance with the devil. But then, I felt something hit my shoulder. A rope. A heavy, grease-stained rope. "Grab it, Watson. Grab it or you're a dead man." I looked through the haze. Barrymore. The butler we thought was a traitor. Standing on solid ground, muscles straining. "I've served this family too long to watch it drown," he roared. With the last of my strength, I wrapped the rope around my arms. Barrymore pulled. I thought my shoulders would pop. The mire didn't let go. It felt like a mouth trying to suck me back in. Schlop, schlop. With one violent tug, I was free. I collapsed onto wet grass, shivering uncontrollably. I looked toward the rock. The blue fire was dying, leaving Holmes standing there, clothes charred, skin blistered, but his eyes, like cold diamonds. Stapleton was backed up to the edge, where the deepest part of the great Grimpen mire waited. "It's over, Jack," Holmes said. "The game is up. You used the legend to hide greed, but the legend turns on the liar." Stapleton looked at the black water, then at the charred man. A wild laugh escaped his lips. "You think you won, Holmes? You think I'm the only one who wanted the Baskerville blood to stop?" He pulled out a small vial. "This isn't phosphorus, it's a gift from the laboratory." Before Holmes could move, Stapleton smashed the vial. Yellow gas exploded, a paralyzing nerve agent. Holmes staggered, knees buckling. Barrymore and I tried to run, but the toxic cloud spread fast. "If I go into the mud," Stapleton hissed, madness in his eyes, "I'm taking the secret with me." He stepped backward, purposely. He dived into the mire. He went down smiling, as if going home. Within seconds, the black slime closed over him. No struggle. Just, gone. I reached Holmes as he collapsed. His pulse was weak, skin simmering. I looked over the moor, yellow gas cleared. But something was wrong, boss. The howling didn't stop. It got louder. Coming from every direction. The pack wasn't gone. Just waiting for the master to leave. Now, they were hungry. Trapped in a swamp, with a poisoned detective, and a butler with a rope. "Watson," Holmes whispered, gripping my sleeve. The vial, it wasn't just gas. It was a signal. "Look, at the hull." I turned my head, heart stopped. Baskerville Hall was on fire. But the flames weren't orange. They were glowing, sickly, neon green. The nightmare wasn't in the mud, boss. It was inside the house. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning chemicals. Sherlock Holmes was a dead weight in my arms, his breathing shallow, his skin still radiating a heat that felt like a dying star. Behind us, the hounds were circling in the shadows of the fog, their eyes flickering like emerald ghosts. But ahead of us, Baskerville Hall was screaming. Not the people, the house itself. That neon green fire was eating the stone, melting the glass, turning the ancestral home into a glowing ribcage of terror. "You still with me, boss?" Because the line between science and hell just got blurred. "We have to move, Watson," Barrymore yelled, his voice cracking as he helped me hoist Holmes's limp body. "The gas Stapleton released, it's a catalyst. That fire, it's not burning the wood, it's consuming the air." He was right. As we stumbled toward the gates, I felt my lungs tightening. Every breath felt like swallowing needles. The green flames weren't throwing off heat, they were throwing off a freezing, numbing cold. The grass around the hall was turning to white ash, and the statues of the Baskerville ancestors were cracking, their stone faces peeling away to reveal something dark and metallic underneath. "Wait!" I gasped, stopping for a second. "Holmes, look at the statues." Holmes's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and unfocused. He looked at the crumbling stone, and a shudder went through his scorched frame. "Not stone, Watson." He wheezed, a bitter laugh escaping his blistered lips. "Lead." They were lined with lead. Hugo Baskerville wasn't just a murderer, he was a chemist. He was hiding something in the walls, something that needed to stay cold. Suddenly, the main doors of the hall blew outward. A wave of green light washed over the lawn, and out walked Sir Henry. But it wasn't the man we knew. He was walking like a marionette with broken strings. His skin was translucent, glowing with that same sickly light, and his eyes. Boss, his eyes were gone. Just two empty sockets filled with emerald fire. "Henry!" I shouted, but Barrymore pulled me back. "That's not him, Dr. Watson," the butler whispered, his face twisted in pure, ancestral dread. "The curse isn't a dog, the curse is the blood. When the hall burns green, the master returns." Sir Henry, or whatever was wearing his skin, raised a hand. The circling hounds stopped their growling. They lowered their heads, whimpering, and crawled toward him like beaten curs. He wasn't their prey anymore. He was their king. He looked toward us, and a voice that sounded like grinding rocks echoed through the moor. "Give me the detective." The entity hissed. "He carries the catalyst." I looked at Holmes. In his clenched fist, he was holding that small, black bottle he'd used to set himself on fire. It wasn't just a chemical, it was a key. Stapleton didn't want the money, he wanted what was inside Holmes's mind. The formula to control the green fire. "Never," I muttered, leveling my revolver at the thing that used to be my friend. I fired. The bullet hit Sir Henry square in the chest. But there was no blood. Just a spray of green sparks. He didn't even flinch. He kept coming, slow, inevitable, while the hounds began to close the circle again. We were trapped between a burning hell, a possessed air, and a pack of monsters. "The mire," Holmes whispered, his hand gripping my arm with sudden, violent strength. "Watson, the only thing that stops the reaction is the black mud. We have to go back in." "Back in?" I yelled. "We just got out." "Do it, boss." Holmes growled, his old authority returning for a split second. "Or we all become fuel for his fire." We turned and ran, back toward the bubbling, stinking darkness of the great Grimpen mire. Behind us, the green light was spreading across the moor, turning the fog into a glowing sea of poison. I could hear the heavy thud of the hound's paws, and the silent, terrifying footsteps of the master. We reached the edge of the swamp. The mud was waiting, a black, hungry mouth. I looked at the fire, then at the mud. "On my mark," Holmes said, his eyes fixed on the approaching green shadow. 3, 2. But before he could say 1, the ground beneath us didn't just sink. It exploded. Something massive, something that had been sleeping under the mire for centuries, decided it was time to wake up. And it wasn't on our side. The explosion didn't sound like gunpowder, it sounded like the earth was screaming. A massive plume of black, oily mud shot 50 feet into the air, raining down like cold, dead flesh. Sherlock Holmes and I were thrown backward by the shockwave, landing hard on the trembling crust. Then, the ground didn't just shake, it lifted. Something was rising from the depths of the mire, feeding on Baskerville blood for centuries. "Are you ready, boss?" The legend didn't lie, it just omitted the size of the horror. It wasn't a hound. It was a colossus. A hulking mass of matted fur, wet clay, and ancient bone. It stood 12 feet at the shoulder, its body a patchwork of rotted moss and jagged lead plates fused into its skin. Its eyes. Boss, they weren't green. They were white, milky, blind orbs that sensed the world through the vibration of our hearts. This was the original, the progenitor of the curse, the beast Hugo Baskerville hadn't just hunted, but tried to engineer into a god. The green-eyed hounds we'd fought before. They were just its offspring. They immediately stopped their attack and flattened themselves against the mud, whining in a frequency that made my teeth ache. Even the master, the thing wearing Sir Henry's skin, stepped back, the emerald fire in its sockets flickering with fear. "The catalyst, Watson!" Holmes yelled, coughing up gray ash as he struggled to stand. "The black bottle. It's the only thing this titan fears." But it was too late. The titan swung a massive, mud-caked limb, hitting the ground near us with the force of a falling building. The impact sent Barrymore flying into the darkness, and the bottle, the only weapon we had, slid across the slick mud, landing inches away from the beast's weight. "I'll get it!" I shouted, but my legs felt like lead. The titan turned its massive, sightless head toward me. It didn't need eyes. It could smell the salt in my sweat, the iron in my blood. It opened its maw, revealing rows of teeth like shattered tombstones. A low, sub-bass growl vibrated through the very marrow of my bones. "Don't move, Watson, don't even breathe," Holmes whispered, his hand reaching for a flare. But someone else moved first. Stapleton. Wait. Stapleton was dead, right? We saw him dive into the mud. But out of the bubbling blackness, a hand reached out. Then a head. Stapleton crawled out of the mire like a drowned rat, his skin stained black, his eyes wide with a religious frenzy. He wasn't trying to escape, he was worshipping. "My king!" Stapleton shrieked, his voice cracking with madness. "I have brought you the blood. I have brought you the detective." He ran toward the titan, reaching for the black bottle. But the beast didn't recognize its master. To the titan, everything was just fuel. With a movement so fast it was a blur, the beast's jaws snapped shut. There was no scream. Just the sound of breaking dry wood. Stapleton was gone in a single gulp, his legacy ending in the gut of the monster he tried to control. The titan swallowed, and then it turned its attention back to us. The emerald fire from the hall was reflecting off its wet hide, making it look like a mountain of moving jade. Sir Henry, the possessed entity, raised its hands, and the green fire from the house began to stream across the air, flowing into the titan's mouth. "It's feeding it." Holmes gasped, his face pale as he realized the trap. "The fire isn't a weapon, it's a battery. If that thing absorbs the entire energy of the hall, it will march on London." The titan began to glow. The moss on its back turned a vibrant, toxic green. Its blind eyes started to pulse with light. It let out a roar that blew the fog away for miles, a sound that announced the birth of a new god. "The bottle, Watson. Now!" Holmes screamed. I lunged. I dove through the freezing mud, my hand closing around the cold glass of the black bottle just as a massive paw came down. I felt the wind of the impact, the mud spraying into my eyes, but I had it. "Throw it into the fire," I told myself, my voice a frantic internal prayer. But I didn't throw it at the beast. I looked at the possessed Sir Henry, the source of the green stream. If I could break the connection, the Titan would starve. I stood up, my feet sinking, and I aimed the bottle like a grenade. But then, I saw her. Beryl Stapleton. She had escaped her bonds and was standing right behind the possessed Henry, a heavy iron bar in her hands. "No, Watson. Don't," she screamed. "If you break the fire, the beast will explode." Too late. The bottle was already in the air. It struck the emerald stream, and the world didn't just turn green, it turned white. When the bottle hit the emerald stream, time stopped. The collision created a fracture, a jagged rip of light swallowing the green fire, the Titan, and the more. For a few seconds, silence. No howling, no bubbling mud, just a ringing like needles piercing my brain. "Are you still there, boss?" For a moment, I thought I was dead. And honestly, death would have been more peaceful. The explosion pulled us. Every scrap of energy was sucked into the vacuum where the bottle shattered. I saw the possessed Sir Henry collapse like a puppet with cut strings. The green fire vanished from his eyes, leaving charred, smoking holes. But the Titan didn't collapse. It began to change. The white light fused with the lead plates in its skin. The beast was no longer mud and fur, it was living, liquid metal. It roared, a metallic, screeching frequency that made the ground beneath us crack. "The reaction is unstable, Watson." Holmes's voice cracked. He was crawling toward me, hands raw from chemical burns. "Without the fire to feed on, the Titan is becoming a bomb. A biological reactor with no cooling system." "How long, Holmes?" I yelled, pulling Beryl Stapleton away from a newly formed fissure. "Minutes, boss, maybe seconds." Holmes looked toward the burning hull. The green fire was gone, replaced by a terrifying, pulsing white glow from the basement. "The source isn't the dog, it's the vault." Hugo Baskerville found a fallen star. A meteorite radiating poison for centuries. Suddenly, the liquid metal Titan turned toward the hull. It wanted the mother source. It wanted the star. Every step it took, the ground turned to glass. Clang. Clang. Clang, like a hammer hitting an anvil. If it reaches the vault, the moor becomes a wasteland. Beryl screamed. My brother knew. He wasn't trying to claim the inheritance, he was building an army to contain it. "Wait. Boss, stop. Everything we thought about Stapleton was a lie. He wasn't the villain, he was a desperate man trying to stop an apocalypse. And we just killed him. We have to stop it, Holmes." I cried, but what could a revolver do against a mountain of white fire? Holmes didn't answer. He was staring at the Titan, mind working at a speed no human could match. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not of death, but of the choice he had to make. "Watson," he whispered, "there's only one way to neutralize a falling star. It needs a human conductor to ground the reaction. No, Holmes, you can't." He stood up, charred coat flapping in the radioactive wind. "You're the better man, Watson. Tell the world that Sherlock Holmes died solving the ultimate mystery." "Holmes, don't." I lunged, but he was too fast. He ran toward the deepest, most toxic part of the swamp. He wasn't a man anymore, he was a lightning rod. He raised his hand, holding a jagged shard of the shattered bottle humming with energy. The Titan sensed it. The power surge. It turned and faced Holmes. The blind, white eyes locked onto the detective with electronic hunger. "Come and get it," Holmes roared. The Titan lunged. A mass of liquid metal hit Holmes with the force of a train. But Holmes didn't break. He held on, wrapping his arms around the beast's neck as the shard in his hand turned blinding. The world went white. A pillar of light shot up from the mire, turning night into artificial day. I saw their silhouettes fused, man and monster, sinking slowly into the mud. The mud didn't bubble, it crystallized. Within seconds, the moor was silent. The light faded. The fire, the hounds, and Sherlock Holmes were gone. I stood at the edge, staring at a field of jagged glass where my friend had been. No body. No traces. Just the silence of the moor. "He did it, boss," I whispered. "He killed the legend." But then, I looked at the mud near my feet. A single, human footprint. It wasn't Holmes's. And it wasn't mine. It was heading away, toward the dark woods. And next to it, was a single, glowing, green claw mark. The moor was dead. No wind, no birds, just a terrifying, crystalline silence that echoed in my ears like a scream. I stood at the edge of the mire, staring at the field of black glass where Sherlock Holmes had sacrificed his soul to stop a cosmic god. Beryl Stapleton was gone. Barrymore was gone, it was just me and the silence. Are you listening, boss? Because the worst part about a mystery is when you finally get the answer you weren't looking for. I looked down at that footprint again. It was deep, forced into the cooling glass as if the person who made it weighed twice as much as a normal man. And that green, glowing claw mark next to it. It wasn't a print left by a beast, it was a leak. Like something inside that person was bleeding light. I followed the trail. It led away from the destruction, toward the Grimpen Woods, a place so dark and tangled that even the legend of the hound didn't dare enter. The trees there didn't have leaves, they had jagged, blackened limbs that looked like they were trying to claw their way out of the earth. Every step I took, the air grew colder, and the smell of sulfur returned, but this time, it was mixed with the scent of burned ozone. "Holmes!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "If you're out there, answer me." No answer. Just the sound of my own breath, and a faint, metallic scraping coming from the shadows ahead. Scree, scree. Like a surgeon's knife dragging across a sheet of metal. I reached a small clearing. In the center, sitting on a rotted stump, was a figure. It was wearing a charred, blackened coat. The silhouette was unmistakable. It was him. Holmes. I whispered, my hand trembling as I reached for my revolver. I didn't want to use it, but my instincts were screaming at me to run. The figure didn't turn. Logic, Watson. The voice said. But it wasn't Holmes's voice. It was a chorus of 1,000 whispers, vibrating at a frequency that made my nose start to bleed. Logic is a human cage. And the cage is broken. The figure stood up, slowly. He turned around, and I fell to my knees. It was Holmes, but he was transparent. His skin was like smoked glass, and through his chest, I could see the glowing, white remains of the meteorite, pulsing like a dying heart. His eyes were no longer gray, they were voids of shifting, emerald fire. He wasn't a man anymore, boss. He was a vessel. A living container for the energy that had been buried under the mire for an eternity. Holmes, what happened to you? I choked out. He stepped forward, and the grass beneath his feet turned to white ash instantly. The detective is gone, Watson. He died in the mud. But the observer has finally opened his eyes. He raised a hand, and the air around it began to distort, like heat rising from a desert road. Stapleton was right. This power, it's not a curse. It's an evolution. Suddenly, I heard a low growl from the trees behind him. One of the hounds, the last of the pack, stepped into the light. It didn't attack. It walked toward the glass man and lowered its head. Holmes, or the thing wearing his face, reached out and touched the beast. The hound didn't yelp. It shattered. It broke into a million glowing shards that were instantly absorbed into Holmes's glass skin. He grew taller, his frame becoming more jagged, more monstrous. The star is hungry, boss, I realized, the terror finally breaking my mind. He looked at me, and for a split second, a tiny, flickering spark of the old Sherlock Holmes appeared in those emerald voids. Run. Watson. He whispered, his real voice fighting through the static. Before the hunger finds you too. But I couldn't run. Because behind me, the fog was rising again. But it wasn't gray. It was bright, neon, green. And inside the fog, I could see the shapes of the people from the village, walking toward the woods like mindless drones. The infection wasn't over. It was spreading. And the man I once called my best friend, was now the Alpha. The fog didn't just smell like sulfur, it smelled like thought. Every time that neon green mist touched my skin, I heard 1,000 voices whispering secrets. I was standing in the grim Penn woods, staring at the glass thing that used to be Sherlock Holmes. He was absorbing the essence of the moor, growing more jagged, more impossible. You still with me, boss? The man who solved the impossible has now become the impossible himself. The infection, it's not a virus, Watson. The voice vibrated without Holmes's lips moving. It's a network. A library of souls. Hugo Baskerville didn't want to kill, he wanted to live forever inside the light. I looked behind me. The villagers were walking into the woods in a silent line. Their eyes were glowing like emerald lanterns. They weren't fighting. They were ascending. They touched the glass man and dissolved into glowing dust, pulled into the pulsing meteorite heart inside Holmes's chest. "Stop it, Holmes!" I screamed, leveling my revolver at the glowing void. "This is mass murder. The end of everything." He looked at me, and the emerald fire dimmed. "No, it's the end of suffering. Within the hive, no logic, no pain, no death. Only the star." He stepped closer, and the ground turned to data. Glowing geometric shapes drifted up from the dirt, swirling like a digital storm. A shot rang out. Not mine. Beryl Stapleton stepped from behind a tree. She held a flare gun, her face covered in protective paint. "The core is exposed," she yelled. "If we hit the meteorite now, we shatter the vessel. The vessel is Holmes, Beryl. If we shatter it, he dies." "He's already dead, boss," she screamed, her eyes wild. "Look at him. That's not a man, that's a doorway. And if it opens all the way, the star consumes the planet." Holmes, the glass man, tilted his head. A sound like 1,000 violins snapping echoed. He raised his hand, and the fog solidified into a spear of light. He wasn't defending, he was cleansing the resistance. "The girl is a variable. Variables must be deleted." He hurled the spear. I dove for Beryl, knocking her into the mud as the light spear disintegrated the tree. The impact created a vacuum. Everything within 5 feet was simply erased. "Watson." A familiar voice cracked through the static. It was the real Holmes. The spark was back. In my coat, the inner lining, the black vial. I kept a backup. I realized then, boss. Holmes had kept a failsafe. He knew he might lose his soul, and hid the poison inside his suit. "I can't reach it, Holmes." "You don't have to reach it. You have to break me." He opened his arms, exposing the pulsing, white heart of the star. He was fighting the hive, forcing the glass to become brittle, giving me one impossible shot. "Do it, boss." Beryl urged, handing me the flare gun. My hands shook. I looked into those emerald voids one last time. I didn't see a monster. I saw the man who shared 1,000 nights at Baker Street. The man who taught me the truth is often painful, but necessary. "I'm sorry, Sherlock," I whispered. I pulled the trigger. The flare hit him like a key. Red fire collided with white light, and the world turned a screaming crimson. The glass man shattered into 1,000,000,000 pieces, the fog sucked into the earth, and a wave of energy knocked me into darkness. When I woke, the fog and light were gone. The woods were dead. I looked for Beryl, but she was nowhere. All I found were piles of white ash. In the center was a blackened crater. In it lay a charred violin string and a gold pocket watch. I picked it up. It was still ticking. But as I opened the cover, boss, my heart stopped. The hands weren't moving forward. They were moving backward. Rapidly. And from the shadows, I heard footsteps. The light, rhythmic click of a gentleman's shoe. "Excellent shot, Watson," a voice whispered. "But you forgot, energy cannot be destroyed, it can only be reallocated." I stood frozen in that blackened crater, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The gold watch in my hand was ticking backward so fast the gears were screaming. Click, 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 click. And then, the footsteps stopped. Right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just felt a cold, clinical presence that made the air around me feel heavy, like I was standing at the bottom of a dark ocean. Are you listening, boss? Because this is where the mystery ends, and the nightmare begins. I told you once, Watson, that when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The voice was clear now. It was Holmes's voice, but it was too perfect. Too calm. But what if the truth is that the impossible was never the enemy? I slowly turned my head. It was him. Sherlock Holmes. He was standing there, perfectly dressed in his tweed suit, not a single burn mark on his skin, not a single hair out of place. He looked younger, stronger, and his eyes, they were gray again. But they weren't human eyes, boss. They were like two polished mirrors, reflecting everything in the woods, but holding nothing inside. Holmes, how? You shattered. I saw you dissolve into the hive. I gasped, my revolver feeling like a toy in my hand. He smiled, a thin, sharp movement of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. The hive is a primitive word, Watson. Let's call it an upgrade. The meteorite was a massive data storage device, and I am the only mind capable of processing that entire archive. He stepped toward me, and I noticed that his shadow didn't match his movements. His shadow was still tall, jagged, and had two glowing eyes. What about the people, Holmes? The villagers. Beryl, they're all ash. I screamed. He tilted his head, looking at the piles of white dust as if they were discarded scraps of paper. A necessary sacrifice for the ultimate observation. I can now see every crime before it happens. I can hear every lie whispered in the dark. I am no longer a detective, Watson. I am the law. He reached out and touched the gold watch in my hand. The ticking stopped instantly. The hands froze at exactly 12 o'clock. London is waiting for us, Watson. Baker Street is waiting. But we won't be taking the train. Space and time are just variables that I've learned to edit. He looked up at the sky, and the stars began to shift. They were moving, realigning themselves into a pattern I didn't recognize. A geometric shape that looked like a massive, celestial eye. You're not him, I whispered, tears blurring my vision. You're just the monster wearing his memories. Does it matter, boss? The thing that looked like Holmes asked, looking directly into my soul. The world is chaotic. It is bloody. It is inefficient. I am going to fix it. One soul at a time. He turned toward the horizon, and the fog rose to meet him, turning into a staircase of green light. He began to walk, his leather shoes clicking against the air as if it were solid stone. Don't bother with the memoirs, Watson. History is being rewritten as we speak. And you're the only witness left who remembers the old world. I watched him walk until he disappeared into the clouds, a man of glass and fire who had become the very god he once tried to debunk. I looked back at the moor, but the great Grimpen Mire was gone. In its place was a sea of black glass, reflecting the new, cold stars above. I'm sitting here now, in a London I don't recognize. The people move in perfect rhythm. There is no crime. There is no fear. Because everyone knows, he is watching. He is in the walls, he is in the fog, he is in the very air we breathe. I look at the empty chair across from me in 221B. Sometimes I see a flicker of a man with a pipe and a violin. But then, the air ripples, and I see the green fire. The case of the Baskervilles is closed, boss. But the detective, he never really came home. He just expanded. Good night, boss, if you can still find a place where the light doesn't reach. The watch is ticking again, but it's not counting seconds anymore. It's counting down, to the moment he decides to observe you. Close your eyes, and listen to the sound of the silence eating away at the walls of your room. London, 1894, wasn't just a city, it was a grinder for souls lost in the fog. Inside the courtroom, the air was as heavy as lead, and every eye was fixed on one man, Professor Moriarty. He didn't stand there like a defendant, he stood there as if he were the one judging the entire world. His eyes were black holes, absorbing any light that dared to come near, and a faint smile was etched onto his lips, the smile of a man who knows that the law is nothing more than an old joke. When the judge uttered the word, "not guilty," the silence that filled the room was more terrifying than a death rattle. Moriarty walked down the aisle smoothly, as if he were swimming through water. He stopped next to Sherlock Holmes for a single second, and whispered words that made the blood freeze in Holmes's veins. The real crime, Holmes, isn't killing someone. The real crime is making them wish for death while they're still breathing. The game has begun, and the music starts tonight. The man vanished into the fog, and Holmes remained in his place, hearing the echo of those words in his mind. Are you still with me, boss? Because what Moriarty is preparing has nothing to do with flesh and blood. He is preparing a frequency that will make the whole city walk with its eyes closed toward the abyss. At 221B, Baker Street, there was nothing but a single candle dying in the corner, and the smell of old tobacco filling the space. Holmes was sitting, motionless, like a wax statue. In front of him was a glass jar, with a small fly trying to escape, and Holmes was holding his violin, producing a single note, a sharp, continuous note, piercing the ear like a nail. Vibrations, Watson, every heart in this universe has a frequency that shakes it, and if you find the right note, you can break that heart without ever touching its owner. Holmes watched the fly as it began to stagger, its wings weakening, until it went completely silent, and fell to the bottom of the jar, a lifeless corpse. The bell rang, the ring was fast and fragmented, like a plea from someone drowning. Enter, and Brandon, a woman from whom beauty had fled, leaving only pure terror in its place. She placed a yellowed paper on the table, paper that smelled like it had been pulled from a graveyard. On it was drawn, the albatross, the seabird that legends say brings a curse that only death can break. The bird was drawn with broken wings, and its eyes were staring at, and in defiance. My father received this paper exactly 10 years before he was murdered. And said the sentence in a choked voice, her eyes searching the dark corners of the room. And this morning, I found the same paper tucked under my brother Lloyd's door. Holmes didn't touch the paper, he stared at it coldly, and asked one question that made her entire body shiver. Has your brother started hearing music? Music with no source. And went silent, and her tears began to fall in a terrifying stillness. Gaucho music, Mr. Holmes, a funeral dirge from the Andes, as if someone is playing it inside his head. At that moment, the light in the room began to flicker, and the fog started creeping in from under the door in an unnatural way, like a living creature searching for its prey. Holmes stood up, put on his overcoat, and looked at Watson with a gaze devoid of any emotion. "Moriarty doesn't kill with bullets, Watson, he kills with anticipation, and tonight, Lloyd Brandon is waiting for his turn in the shadow of death. Close your eyes, boss, and let this frequency take control of your nerves, because in the next chapter, Lloyd will be walking down a dead-end street, the fog will close in on him from every side, and he will hear the sound of wood tapping on the pavement, a tap, then silence, then another tap, and the music will grow louder, until the soul finally leaves the body. Deep breath, let the air fill your lungs, and feel the chill. London at night is a graveyard of secrets, and tonight, the fog is acting as the shroud. Lloyd Brandon was walking alone. He wasn't a man who believed in ghosts, but tonight, the shadows felt heavy. Every street lamp he passed seemed to dim as he approached, as if the light itself was afraid to touch him. He could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum inside his chest, echoing against the damp brick walls of the alleyways. He remembered the drawing of the albatross. He remembered the way the ink looked like dried blood. And then, he heard it. A faint whistle, a melody that didn't belong in the heart of a city. It was the Gaucho dirge, a song for the dead, born in the high, lonely peaks of the Andes. It was haunting, slow, and it felt like it was being hummed right into the back of his neck. Lloyd stopped. The music didn't stop. It grew louder, vibrating through the soles of his boots. "Are you listening, boss? Because this isn't just music, it's a lock turning in the door of his soul." Back at 221B, Baker Street, the fire in the hearth had turned to gray ash. Holmes wasn't sleeping. He was standing by the window, his silhouette cut out of the darkness. He held a small, silver tuning fork. He struck it against the glass. Ping! "The resonance is changing, Watson," he whispered, his voice as sharp as a razor. "The killer isn't following Lloyd. The killer is already there, in the frequency of the air around him." Watson looked up from his notes, his face pale. "You mean he's being haunted, Holmes?" "No, Watson," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "He's being tuned. Moriarty is playing him like a string on a cello, and the bow is about to draw blood." Lloyd Brandon started to run. His footsteps splashed through the greasy puddles of Fleet Street. But no matter how fast he ran, the music followed. It was everywhere. It was in the wind, in the groan of the old buildings, in the very fog that was now blinding him. And then, a new sound joined the melody. Tap. Silence. Tap. It was the sound of wood striking stone. A rhythmic, hollow sound. The sound of a man with a wooden leg, walking with a purpose that defied the natural world. Lloyd turned a corner into a dead-end alley. The brick wall loomed in front of him like a tombstone. He turned around, gasping for air, but there was no one there. Only the fog, swirling like a gray ghost. But the tapping was getting closer. Tap. Tap. It was right in front of him, yet the alley was empty. "Who's there?" Lloyd screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the mist. Suddenly, he felt a pressure around his throat. Not hands, not a rope, but something thin, something made of feathers and bone. The bolus. The ancient weapon of the South American plains, flying through the air with a silent, deadly grace. In that moment, the gaucho music reached a screaming crescendo. Lloyd's knees hit the cobblestones. He tried to claw at his neck, but the more he fought, the tighter the vibration became. He looked up, and for a split second, the fog parted. He didn't see a man. He saw a shadow with a wooden leg and eyes that glowed with the same blue light that Moriarty had in the courtroom. The shadow leaned in and whispered a single note, the final note of the song. And then, the world went black. In the silence that followed, only the tap-tap of the wooden leg remained. Then, that too faded into the mist. At 2:21 the silver tuning fork in Holmes's hand suddenly snapped in half. Holmes looked at the broken metal and sighed. "It's over, Watson. The first movement of the symphony is complete." "What do you mean?" Watson asked, trembling. Holmes turned away from the window, his face a mask of cold stone. "Lloyd Brandon is dead, and the albatross has found its next neck to hang around. Close your eyes, boss, let the sound of that wooden leg echo in your mind. Because in the next chapter, Holmes will find the body, and he will realize that the killer didn't leave a single fingerprint, only a residue of a soul that should have stayed buried 10 years ago. Sleep well, if the music lets you. Step into the cold, can you feel it? The air in the morgue doesn't just chill your skin, it freezes the thoughts inside your head." Lloyd Brandon was lying on the slate table, his skin the color of the fog that killed him. There was no blood. No struggle. Just a deep, purple bruise circling his neck like a necklace of shadows. Sherlock Holmes stood over the body, his magnifying glass hovering inches away from the skin. He wasn't looking for fingerprints. He was looking for resonance. "Look at the skin, Watson," Holmes whispered, his voice echoing off the tiled walls like a ghost. The capillaries didn't just burst, they shattered, as if they were hit by a sound wave they couldn't survive. Watson stood back, his hand trembling as he held the lantern. "The police say it was a robbery gone wrong, Holmes. A stray rope, a common thug." Holmes looked up, his eyes two burning embers in the dim light. "A thug doesn't leave a feather in the middle of a London alley, Watson." He held up a pair of tweezers. Between them was a single, white feather, tipped with the red clay of South America. "Are you still awake, boss? Because the mystery is starting to breathe. This isn't London crime. This is a spiritual debt being collected." Holmes walked to the corner of the room, where Lloyd's clothes were piled. He picked up the coat and gave it a sharp shake. A small, carved stone fell out. It was a bolus ball, but it was inscribed with ancient symbols that seemed to move if you stared at them too long. "The Andes, Watson, the high peaks where the air is too thin for lies." At that exact moment, miles away in a hidden cellar, Moriarty was sitting in front of a massive pipe organ. But the pipes weren't filled with air. They were filled with souls. He pressed a key, and a low, subsonic vibration shook the foundations of the building. He smiled, a cold, mechanical stretching of the skin. "The second note is ready, Holmes. Are you ready to dance?" He wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking to the shadow standing behind him, a shadow with a wooden leg that didn't cast a reflection. Back in Baker Street, the clock struck midnight. The sound seemed to linger in the air longer than usual. Holmes was back at his desk, surrounded by maps of South America and ancient scrolls on acoustic necromancy. 10 years ago, Watson and Lloyd's father was part of an expedition to the Andes. They found something they shouldn't have, a frequency used by the ancient priests to silence their enemies. Holmes struck a tuning fork against the bolas stone. The stone didn't just ring, it screamed. A high-pitched, ethereal shriek that made the glass windows in the room crack. Watson covered his ears, his face contorted in pain. "Make it stop, Holmes." Holmes caught the stone in his hand, silencing it. "That scream, Watson, that is the melody the Brandon family has been hearing. It's not a song, it's a homing beacon. A spiritual signal that tells the killer exactly where they are sleeping." Suddenly, the front door of 221B creaked open. There was no knock. Just the slow, heavy sound of a footstep. Thump. Drag. Thump. The wooden leg was on their stairs. Holmes didn't reach for his gun. He reached for his violin. "He's not here for us yet, Watson. He's here to deliver the second omen. A white envelope was slid under the door. Inside was another drawing of the albatross, but this time, the bird was headless. And written in ink that looked like it was still wet, was a single name, ANN. "Stay very still, don't even breathe. The darkness in Baker Street tonight feels like it has teeth." The white envelope lay on the floor like a fallen shroud. ANN, the name wasn't just written, it was carved into the paper with a malice that seemed to vibrate. Holmes stood over it, his face illuminated by the dying embers of the fireplace. He didn't pick it up. He was listening to the stairs. Thump. Drag. Silence. The wooden leg had stopped right outside the door. Watson had his revolver out, his knuckles white as bone. "I'll take him, Holmes. I'll blow that shadow back to the hell it came from." But Holmes held up a hand. "No, Watson. You can't shoot a reverberation. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped so fast that their breath turned into a gray mist in the air. The music started, but it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from the walls. A low, guttural chanting, the sound of 1,000 dead voices whispering in a language that died before the pyramids were built. Then, as quickly as it began, the sound vanished. Holmes threw open the door. The hallway was empty. No man. No shadow. Only the faint, lingering scent of ozone and ancient dust. But on the floor, right where the footsteps had stopped, was a trail of white feathers, leading all the way down the stairs and out into the fog. "He's baiting us, Watson," Holmes whispered. "He's not just a killer, he's a conductor. And we are just notes in his symphony. Are you still there, boss? Because the game just changed. This isn't a chase anymore, it's a selection." Holmes retreated to his desk, pulling out a dusty, leather-bound ledger. 10 years ago, the Andes expedition, 6 men went up that mountain. 5 came back rich. The 6th, a man named Mateo, the local guide, was left for dead in a ritual cave to save the others' gold. Holmes pointed to a name on the list of survivors, Sir Ronald Ramsgate. "The man in charge of the crown jewels, Watson. The man Moriarty is currently visiting. The connection snapped into place like a trap. Moriarty wasn't just stealing jewels, he was using Mateo's ghost a frequency of pure vengeance, to clear his path. Moriarty found the note that controls the shadow, Watson. He's using the Brandon family's guilt to tune the killer to their specific bloodline. Deep in the bowels of the city, in a place where the sun never reaches, Moriarty was watching a different kind of map. It was a map of vibrations. He watched as a small blue light, and Brandon, flickered with fear. Behind him, the man with the wooden leg stood perfectly still. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a shell filled with the albatross curse. "Go," Moriarty whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping on a grave. "And is at the Brandon estate. Make her hear the music, make her see the wings." Back at the estate, and Brandon was huddled in her bed. The windows were locked. The doors were bolted. But the fog doesn't need a door. She started to hear it. A soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the ceiling. Tap. Tap. And then, the melody began. It was sweet. It was beautiful. It was the sound of her father's voice, calling her from the bottom of a deep, dark well. She stood up, her eyes glazed, moving like a puppet on invisible strings. She walked toward the balcony. Outside, the fog was swirling into the shape of a giant bird with broken wings. And sitting on the railing was a man with one leg and a face made of shifting gray mist. He held the bolus in his hand, spinning it slowly, creating a low, humming sound that paralyzed her heart. "Holmes!" Watson shouted as they raced through the London streets in a hansom cab. "We'll be too late." Holmes was staring into the darkness, his eyes reflecting nothing. "Speed won't save her, Watson. Only the counternote will." He pulled out his violin and began to tune it to a frequency so high it was almost silent. "If I can't stop the shadow, I'll have to break the instrument that's playing it." Silence, it's the loudest world when you're waiting for a scream. The Brandon estate was a fortress of stone, but stones have memory. And Brandon stood on the balcony, her feet bare on the cold marble, her eyes fixed on the gray void of the fog. The man with the wooden leg didn't move. He sat on the railing like a gargoyle, the bolus in his hand. The effect was vibrating inside her skull, erasing her will, turning her blood into ice water. Just as the shadow leaned forward to cast the deadly chord, a sharp presence shattered the night. Sherlock Holmes was standing in the garden below, his bow moving with a violent, frantic energy. He wasn't performing, he was creating a disruption. The shadow, acting like steam escaping a pipe, vanished into the mist, the bolus clattering uselessly against the stone. "He's gone, Watson. Get her inside." Holmes indicated, his chest heaving. The frequency had been broken, but the air still felt thick with malice. "Are you still awake, boss?" Because the shadow didn't retreat out of fear. It retreated because it was called back to a bigger hunt. Back in the safety of the study, and was trembling, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. "He looked like Matteo," she whispered, her presence barely a breath. "But Matteo died in the mountains. I saw the reports." Holmes paced the room, his eyes scanning the titles on the bookshelves without seeing them. Matteo didn't just die, and he was sacrificed. And Moriarty has found the resonant key to that sacrifice. He turned to a map of London spread out on the table. "The Brandon family was the distraction, Watson. Moriarty used the albatross to keep us here, at the estate, while he moved his real pieces into place. He pointed to a single spot on the map, the Tower of London. Tonight, the Star of Delhi arrives. The largest emerald in the world. A gem so pure, it acts as a spiritual conductor. Watson looked confused. You think he's going to steal a jewel using a ghost? Holmes looked at him with a gaze that was cold and hollow. He's not stealing it for the money, Watson. He's stealing it because that emerald, when tuned to the right frequency, can amplify Mateo's note 1,000 times over. He doesn't want to kill a family, he wants to settle a city. Across the city, inside the reinforced walls of the tower, Sir Ronald Ramsgate was overseeing the arrival of the gem. It sat in a velvet-lined box, glowing with a deep, sickly green light. Sir Ronald felt a sudden sharp pain in his leg, the leg he almost lost in the Andes 10 years ago. A phantom pain. He froze. He knew that sensation. Suddenly, the guards at the door slumped to the ground. No action was visible. No blades were drawn. They just stopped breathing. Moriarty walked into the vault, wearing a tuxedo as if he were attending an opera. Behind him, the shadow with the wooden leg materialized from the green glow of the emerald. The resonance is perfect, Sir Ronald, Moriarty said, his manner smooth and terrifyingly calm. 10 years of guilt, concentrated into one beautiful stone. Moriarty reached out and touched the emerald. The room began to vibrate. The glass cases shattered. The ancient stones of the tower began to manifest a low, mournful state. Holmes is coming, Moriarty. Sir Ronald gasped, clutching his chest. Moriarty smiled, and for a second, his face seemed to dissolve into a swarm of flies. I hope so, Ronald. Every symphony needs an audience, and Holmes is about to experience the final movement. At that moment, in the hansom cab racing toward the tower, Holmes felt the vibration in his own teeth. He gripped his violin case tightly. The star is active, Watson. The trap is sprung. He looked out at the London streets. People were stopping in their tracks, covering their ears, their faces twisting in confusion and pain. The city was starting to experience the frequency. Listen, can you hear the city breathing? It's a heavy, jagged breath, like a giant struggling to wake up. The Tower of London stood against the black sky like a jagged tooth. Inside, the air wasn't just cold, it was dead. Holmes and Watson moved through the shadows of the outer wall, their footsteps swallowed by the unnatural hum that was radiating from the White Tower. The Star of Delhi was no longer just a jewel, it was a beating heart of green fire. The frequency is reaching critical mass, Watson, Holmes whispered. He held his silver tuning fork, and the metal was vibrating so violently it was blurred in his hand. Moriarty isn't just stealing the emerald. He's using the tower's ancient stone structure as a speaker. He's turning the entire fortress into a weapon of sound. Watson checked his revolver, but the metal felt strangely hot to the touch. Why, Holmes? Why kill everyone for a stone? Holmes didn't look back. Because silence is the ultimate power, Watson. A city that can't hear itself think is a city that belongs to whoever controls the noise. Are you still with me, boss? Because we're stepping into the dead zone now. They reached the entrance to the jewel chamber. The guards were still there, standing upright, eyes wide open, but they were hollow. Their eardrums had been shattered by the subsonic pulse of the emerald. They were statues of meat and bone, frozen in a moment of eternal scream. Inside the chamber, the green light was blinding. The Star of Delhi sat on its pedestal, vibrating so fast it seemed to be in two places at once. And standing behind it was Moriarty. He looked younger, stronger, his eyes reflecting the emerald's sickly glow. "Welcome to the concert, Holmes," Moriarty said, his voice not coming from his mouth, but echoing directly inside their minds. "You're just in time for the crescendo." Behind Moriarty, the shadow of Matteo was no longer a mist. It was solid. A man with a wooden leg, dressed in the tattered rags of an Andean guide, his face a landscape of ancient scars and ritual paint. He held a bolus made of pure, solidified sound. Thump. Drag. The sound of the wooden leg on the stone floor was like a hammer hitting a coffin lid. "Matteo doesn't want your gold, Moriarty," Holmes shouted, trying to fight the pressure building behind his eyes. "He wants the debt paid in blood. You're using a ghost you can't control." Moriarty laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a vacuum. "Control? I don't control the storm, Holmes. I simply pointed it at the city." He turned to the shadow. "Finish the Brandon line. The girl is here. I can feel her heart beating against the frequency." Holmes turned around. And Brandon was standing at the entrance of the chamber, moved by the same hypnotic tugging that had led her to the balcony. She was a sleepwalker in a nightmare. Matteo raised the bolus. The humming grew to a roar. The very air began to ripple like water. "Watson!" "The resonance!" Holmes screamed. He pulled out his violin, but he didn't play a melody. He jammed the silver tuning fork into the wood of the violin and struck the strings with the back of his bow. Twang! A discordant, ugly, violent note cut through the green light. The Star of Delhi flickered. The shadow of Matteo hesitated, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. "You think a wooden box and some catgut can stop the music of the spheres?" Moriarty sneered. He reached out to touch the emerald, to stabilize the vibration. But as his hand neared the stone, the green light turned a deep, blood red. The star was reacting to Holmes's counter-frequency. The room began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow. The echoes were no longer just sounds, they were physical. Every word ever spoken in that chamber, every scream of a prisoner from 500 years ago, was being pulled out of the stones by the emerald. It was a chamber of echoes, and the echoes were hungry. "Close your eyes, boss. Can you hear the screaming of the past? It's the sound of history being torn apart, and is trapped between the shadow and the red light. Holmes is fighting a god with a violin. And Moriarty is realizing that when you play with the dead always want an encore. The symphony is about to break, and the fragments will be sharp enough to kill. Sleep, if you can tune out the noise. Hold your breath, if you can still find it." The Star of Delhi was no longer a jewel, it was a bleeding eye in the center of the room. The green glow had been corrupted by Holmes's discord, turning into a deep, pulsing red that made the very air feel like it was made of liquid iron. The crimson resonance had begun. The vibrations were so intense that the ancient stones of the tower began to weep, moisture, dark and thick as oil, oozing from the cracks in the masonry. Moriarty was screaming, but no sound came out of his throat. The red frequency had hijacked his nervous system, freezing his muscles in a jagged, electric spasm. He was a prisoner of his own masterpiece. And in the center of the storm, the shadow of Matteo was changing. He wasn't just a guide anymore. The red light was fleshing out his ghost, turning the mist into something raw, something hungry, something that smelled like the cold earth of a 10-year-old grave. Thump. Drag. Thump. The sound was no longer an echo. It was the sound of bone hitting stone. Matteo took a step toward Brandon. His eyes weren't black holes anymore, they were filled with the red fire of the emerald. The debt. A voice rumbled from the floorboards, a voice that sounded like grinding rocks. The debt must be paid in the blood of the line that broke the promise. Are you still awake, boss? Because the walls between this world and the under London are starting to crumble. And was paralyzed, her mind caught in a loop of the gaucho melody, her body leaning toward the red light like a moth to a flame. Watson tried to move toward her, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. Holmes. The frequency, it's breaking us apart. Holmes didn't answer. He was a man possessed. His bow was moving so fast it was invisible, a blur of motion against the dark wood of his violin. The strings were smoking. Literally smoking. The friction between the catgut and the horsehair was generating a heat that defied physics. He was playing the anti-symphony, a chaotic, violent sequence of notes designed to shatter the red light before it reached the death tone. Matteo. Holmes roared over the roar of the crimson wind. Look at the man who holds the key. Look at Moriarty. He is the one who trapped your soul in this stone. He is the one using your pain to feed his hunger. The shadow paused. The bolus in his hand stopped spinning for a fraction of a second. The red light flickered, turning a sickly violet. Moriarty's eyes widened. He felt the tug of the ghost shifting. He tried to reach for the control panel of his organ, hidden beneath the velvet of the pedestal, but the vibrations shattered the wood before he could touch it. No. Moriarty gasped, his voice finally breaking through the resonance. The frequency is mine. The city is mine. But the Star of Delhi had other plans. The emerald, now a pulsing, violet-red heart, began to pull the shadows from the corners of the room. These weren't Matteo's shadows. They were the echoes of the tower. The souls of the beheaded, the tortured, and the forgotten. They were being drawn to the red light like a whirlpool. Suddenly, the floor beneath them began to buckle. The crimson resonance was liquefying the very foundation of the vault. Watson. The girl. Now. Holmes screamed. He hit a final, impossible note, a note so high and so pure that every glass bottle in the London docks miles away shattered at the same time. The star exploded with a flash of violet light. Not a physical explosion, but a spiritual one. A wave of energy washed over them, cold and silent. For a moment, there was absolute stillness. No music. No humming. No footsteps. Only the sound of Brandon falling into Watson's arms. But as the dust settled, the red light didn't fade. It settled on the floor like a carpet of glowing embers. And standing in the center of the room, looking directly at Holmes, was Moriarty. But he wasn't alone. The shadow of Matteo had merged with him. Two faces, overlapping in the flickering violet light. One man of flesh, one man of ghost, joined together by the crimson resonance. You didn't break the symphony, Holmes, the two voices said in perfect, terrifying unison. You just invited the rest of the orchestra to join in. Do you hear that? It's not the wind. It's not the city. It's the sound of 10,000 mouths opening at once, but with no breath to fill them. The crimson resonance had done more than just merge Moriarty with a ghost. It had turned the Tower of London into a spiritual beacon. On the battlements, the air was vibrating so hard that the heavy iron cannons were dancing on their carriages. Below, in the streets of London, the people weren't sleeping anymore. They were standing on their porches, in their nightgowns, eyes milky white, staring toward the tower, humming the same gaucho dirge in a terrifying, low-frequency chorus. Moriarty, or the entity he had become, stood on the edge of the stone wall. His face was a shifting blur of his own calculated features and Matteo's scarred, Andean mask. His voice was no longer a whisper, it was a harmonic that rattled the lungs. The dead isn't just a family secret anymore, Holmes. It's the foundation of this city. London was built on the silence of the forgotten, and tonight, the forgotten are going to sing. Behind him, the violet-red light of the star was shooting into the sky like a spear of fire, piercing the fog. Are you still with me, boss? Because the ground beneath Holmes and Watson was no longer solid. The stones of the tower were beginning to soften, becoming translucent under the power of the vibration. Watson looked over the edge and his face went pale as death. Holmes, the shadows. They're climbing the walls. They weren't men. They were echoes. Gray, flickering shapes of prisoners from centuries past, and Bullen, Guy Fawkes, the nameless thousands who died in the dark. They were being pulled up by the chorus, their mouths moving in perfect sync with Moriarty's frequency. Holmes was leaning against a stone pillar, his hands bleeding from the frantic speed of his violin playing. He looked at Anne Brandon, who was standing in a trance, her hair whipping around her face in the spiritual wind. She's the ground, Watson. Holmes shouted over the roar of the spirits. Moriarty is using her bloodline as the earth for his signal. If we don't break her connection to the star, the whole city will vibrate until their hearts simply stop. Then we have to take her away. Watson yelled, reaching for Anne, but as he touched her, a bolt of violet energy threw him back across the stones. Anne wasn't a girl anymore, she was a resonator. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't her voice. It was the screech of a dying albatross, a sound so high it made the stone gargoyles on the tower crack and crumble into dust. Thump. Drag. Thump. The sound was everywhere now. 1,000 wooden legs hitting the stone in unison. The Matteo Moriarty entity stepped forward, the bolus in his hand glowing with the same violet fire as the emerald. You're fighting the inevitable, Holmes. Science can't stop a moral resonance. You can't tune out the truth of what was done to Matteo, what was done to all of them. He raised the bolus, and the air around it began to warp, creating a miniature, black hole of sound. Holmes stopped playing. He let his violin drop to the floor. The sudden silence was more violent than the noise. For 3 seconds, the only sound was the heartbeat of the city, slow, heavy, and dying. You're right, Moriarty, Holmes said, his voice strangely calm, almost hollow. I can't tune out the truth. But I can change the scale. Holmes reached into his coat and pulled out the small, carved bolus ball Lloyd had died with, the one inscribed with the ancient Andean symbols. He didn't use it as a weapon. He held it against his own throat. Watson. If I can't break the star, I have to become a counter-resonator. I have to feed my own frequency into the loop. Holmes, no. It'll tear your mind apart. Watson screamed. But it was too late. Holmes began to hum. A low, guttural tone that came from the very bottom of his soul. He wasn't humming the dirge. He was humming a dissonance, a note of pure, cold logic against the madness of the spirits. The air between Holmes and the Moriarty entity began to spark with white lightning. The two frequencies collided. The violet light of the star began to pulse erratically. The echoes on the walls began to flicker and scream as their borrowed reality was shredded by the interference. The tower began to groan, a sound of groaning iron and screaming stone. Don't move, don't even blink. The world hasn't gone dark, but the light has become heavy. The Star of Delhi didn't just explode, it opened. In the center of the White Tower, the violet-red resonance had collapsed into a single, terrifying point of absolute blackness. A spiritual vacuum. Every sound in London, the screaming of the echoes, the humming of the city, even the wind, was being pulled into that black hole in the center of the jewel. The void of the emerald had arrived. Moriarty, the entity with two faces, was being pulled toward the pedestal, his form stretching like smoke in a gale. He wasn't a master anymore, he was a fuel source. The Mateo side of his face was laughing, a soundless, hollow vibration that shook the very atoms of the room. You wanted the power of the ancients, Moriarty, the voice echoed from the void. But the ancients didn't want power, they wanted absence. Are you still breathing, boss? Because the air is getting thin. Holmes was on his knees, his throat raw, his body vibrating so hard he looked like a blurred photograph. He was still holding the Andean bolus to his neck, his counternote, the only thing keeping the black hole from expanding and consuming the entire district. His eyes were no longer gray, they were glowing with a cold, white light, the light of pure, mathematical logic fighting against the abyss. Watson. Holmes's voice didn't come from his mouth, it manifested as a pulse in Watson's brain. The girl. Anne. The void is feeding on her regret. If she doesn't forgive the debt, the frequency will never close. Watson looked at Anne Brandon. She was floating inches off the ground, her skin becoming translucent, her veins glowing with a sickly violet light. She was the anchor, holding the doorway open. Every memory of her father's crime, every drop of guilt for the guide Mateo, was being used as a hook by the emerald. Watson crawled through the shifting stone, the floor feeling like liquid tar under his hands. Anne. Listen to me, he roared against the soundless pressure. Mateo isn't a ghost anymore. He's a parasite, fed by your shame. You have to let go of the debt. You have to silence the memory. But Anne couldn't hear him. She was seeing the Andes. She was seeing the cold, blue ice and the man with the wooden leg being left in the dark. She was feeling the weight of the albatross around her neck. Suddenly, the Mateo Moriarty entity reached out a hand made of shadow and bone, and grabbed Anne's throat. Not to kill her, but to connect. The black hole in the emerald flared. The entire white tower began to groan as its stones were pulled toward the center. Outside, in the streets of London, the chorus of sleepwalkers suddenly stopped humming. They all fell to their knees at the same time, their heads tilting back, their mouths wide open, as if their souls were being vacuumed out toward the tower. Holmes. I can't reach her. Watson screamed, his voice being distorted, sounding like he was underwater. Holmes looked at the violin on the floor. The wood was cracked, the strings snapped. He realized that logic wasn't enough. You can't fight a moral debt with a mathematical note. You have to pay it. Holmes stood up, his legs shaking. He walked toward the black sun in the center of the room. As he got closer, his clothes began to tatter, his skin began to crack. He wasn't going to play a note. He was going to become the note. He grabbed the other side of the Andean bolus, the one still held by the Mateo shadow. I am the witness, Mateo. Holmes's voice boomed, a frequency of pure, undeniable truth. I hold the record of the crime. I acknowledge the sacrifice. But the debt is not hers to pay. Holmes closed his eyes and began to channel every memory he had of his own failures, his own coldness, his own mechanical disregard for the human heart. He was feeding the void his own shadow to satisfy its hunger. The room turned a blinding, freezing white. The black hole in the emerald shrieked, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a thought of pure agony. The Moriarty entity began to tear apart. The Mateo half was being pulled into the stone, and the Moriarty half was being thrown back into the physical world. The Star of Delhi began to shrink, its green fire being sucked into its own core. Don't move, the floor is covered in shattered glass, and not all of it is physical. The white tower was silent now, but it was a hollow silence, the kind you find inside a tomb after the mourners have left. The Star of Delhi was gone. In its place, on the velvet pedestal, was nothing but a pile of fine, gray dust that hummed with a dying violet light. The void had retracted, but it had taken the color out of the room. Everything looked like an old, overexposed photograph. Watson was the first to move, his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps. He crawled toward the center of the room, past the unconscious body of Brandon. Holmes, he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Holmes, are you still there? In the center of the vault stood a figure. It looked like Sherlock Holmes. It wore his coat. It had his height. But the eyes were two empty, white screens. Holmes was standing perfectly still, his hands hanging at his sides, his violin bow snapped in his grip. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't breathing. He was a shell waiting for a command. Are you still with me, boss? Because the man you knew is currently scattered across the ley lines of London. By feeding his own identity into the frequency to stop the void, Holmes hadn't just saved the city, he had detuned himself. He was a piano with all the strings cut. Suddenly, a cough broke the silence. From the shadows behind the pedestal, a man stumbled out. It was Moriarty. But the entity was gone. He was just a man again, older, smaller, his tuxedo torn to ribbons, his face pale and trembling. He looked at the dust on the pedestal and let out a weak, hysterical laugh. You did it, Holmes, you traded the great detective for a few million lives. What a pathetic, logical waste. Moriarty tried to stand, but his legs gave out. The Mateo ghost had left a permanent echo in his nervous system. He would never walk without a limp again. Thump. Drag. The curse of the wooden leg had become a physical reality for the professor. "Leave him, Watson," a voice said. It was Holmes, but the voice didn't sound like his. It was monotone, cold, and seemed to come from all corners of the room at once. Holmes slowly turned his head, his white eyes fixing on Watson. The professor is no longer a variable in the equation. He is a remainder. Logic dictates we focus on the anchor, dot. He pointed a trembling finger at Brandon. "Holmes, what are you talking about?" Watson asked, backing away. "And is safe. The debt is paid." But Holmes shook his head with a slow, mechanical precision. "Incorrect. The debt was absorbed, not cancelled. I am currently holding the frequency of the albatross within my own cerebral cortex. If I reintegrate my identity, the frequency will release back into the city." Watson felt a cold spike of horror in his gut. Holmes wasn't just standing there, he was acting as a human capacitor. He was holding the scream of London inside his own mind to keep the city from waking up in madness. "Then what do we do?" Watson asked, tears blurring his vision. "I can't leave you like this. You must fracture the record, Watson," Holmes said, his form beginning to flicker like a dying candle. "Moriarty's organ, the sub-level pipes, they are still tuned to the star. If you destroy the resonant chambers, the frequency will have no home to return to. But you must hurry. My internal clock is failing." At that moment, the tower began to vibrate again. Not from the jewel, but from the memory of the jewel. The shadows of the beheaded prisoners began to reform in the corners, their eyes fixed on Holmes. They recognized the note he was holding. They saw him as their new king. "Go, Watson," the Holmes voice boomed, the white light in his eyes flaring. "Take the girl and run. I will hold the chorus here." Watson grabbed and then began to drag her toward the exit, looking back one last time. He saw Holmes standing in the center of a circle of ghosts, his arms outstretched, his body glowing with a cold, violet fire. He looked like a saint. He looked like a demon. He looked like a man who had finally solved the ultimate riddle, and realized the answer was nothing. "Don't breathe too loud, the walls are listening." The sublevels of the tower weren't built for the living, they were built to hold the weight of centuries of secrets. Watson was dragging Brandon through the narrow, dripping tunnels, his only guide being the thrumming in the floorboards. It wasn't a sound anymore, it was a physical heartbeat that made his teeth ache. Behind them, the white tower was still glowing with that cold, violet fire where Holmes was standing as a human capacitor, holding back the flood of souls. "We're almost there, and stay with me," Watson growled, his voice rasping. They reached a heavy, iron-studded door. As Watson pushed it open, the symphony hit him like a physical blow. It was Moriarty's secret chamber. A massive, cathedral-like cavern filled with thousands of copper pipes that ran like veins across the ceiling and walls. In the center sat the organ, a monstrous machine made of brass, bone, and resonant glass. The pipes weren't blowing air, they were screaming with the residual energy of the Star of Delhi. "Are you still awake, boss?" Because this is the brain of the operation. Every pipe was tuned to a specific street in London. This was the broadcaster that Moriarty used to turn a ghost into a plague. The air in the room was vibrating so fast that Watson's vision began to double. He saw the pipes glowing with a sickly crimson light, matching the crimson resonance that had nearly destroyed Holmes's mind. The resonant chambers. Watson whispered, remembering Holmes's dying instructions. I have to fracture the record. He looked at the base of the organ. There were 12 glass spheres filled with a swirling, dark mist, that echoes that Moriarty had captured to fuel the frequency. Watson raised his revolver, but he knew lead wouldn't be enough. He needed force. He grabbed a heavy iron wrench from a nearby workbench. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the pipes. Thump. Drag. Thump. It was the echo of the wooden leg. Even though Moriarty was crawling in the dust above, his manifestation was still here, protecting the machine. A gray, flickering figure with the face of Matteo and the eyes of a predator. It raised a spectral bolus, the feathers whistling in the vibration of the room. You cannot stop the requiem, Doctor, 1,000 voices whispered from the pipes. The song is already written in the blood of London. Watson didn't back down. He wasn't a detective, he was a soldier. Then I'll just have to change the ending, he roared. He didn't aim for the shadow, he aimed for the first glass sphere. Crack. The sound of the glass shattering was like a lightning strike inside the room. A cloud of black mist exploded outward, and the note of the organ shifted into a dissonant, painful shriek. The shadow of Matteo recoiled, its form flickering like a bad film reel. Upstairs, in the vault, Holmes felt the shift. His white eyes flared with a sudden, agonizing brilliance. The capacitor was leaking. Now, Watson, he shouted through the spiritual link. Break the core. Watson swung again. Crack. Crack. One by one, the spheres shattered. With every break, a piece of the albatross curse was released, turning into a violent wind that began to tear the copper pipes from the walls. The chorus was turning into a chaos. The shadow of the wooden leg began to dissolve, its screams joining the roar of the collapsing machinery. But the final sphere, the master chamber, was made of reinforced resonant glass. Watson's wrench bounced off it with a dull clink. The vibration was reaching a terminal frequency. The star energy was backing up, flowing back toward the vault, toward Holmes. If I don't break this, he'll burn out. Watson realized. He looked at Anne Brandon, who was starting to wake up from her trance. Her eyes were clear for the first time. The debt, Watson. She whispered. It's not in the glass. It's in the hair, dot. She walked toward the organ, her hand reaching for the final sphere. As her fingers touched the glass, the albatross, drawing on the paper in Watson's pocket, suddenly burst into flames. The final debt was being paid, not with blood, but with acceptance. The sphere didn't break, it melted. The violet energy turned into a soft, white light that flowed through Anne's arms and out into the room. The organ let out one final, low, peaceful note, and then went silent. Totally. Deadly. Silent. Listen, it's over. The silence in the White Tower was no longer a vacuum, it was just silence. The violet fire had vanished, leaving behind nothing but the smell of burnt ozone and the cold, grey light of a London dawn. Sherlock Holmes was still standing in the center of the vault. His arms had dropped to his sides, and his violin lay in splinters at his feet. The white light in his eyes had faded, replaced by a dull, hollow gray. He didn't move as Watson and Brandon climbed the stairs from the sublevel. He didn't even turn his head. Watson rushed to his side, his hands trembling as he grabbed Holmes's shoulders. "Holmes! Can you hear me? The organ is destroyed, the frequency is dead." Holmes blinked, a slow, mechanical movement. He looked at Watson, but there was no recognition in his gaze. "The variables have been neutralized," Holmes whispered, his voice sounding like two dry stones rubbing together. "The city is quiet." He slumped forward, his body finally giving up after acting as a vessel for 10,000 screaming souls. "Are you still there, boss? Because the damage to a soul isn't like a wound on the skin. It leaves a shadow." Moriarty was gone. In the chaos of the sub-level requiem, he had crawled away into the labyrinth of the London sewers. But he hadn't escaped whole. Somewhere in the dark, the sound of a wooden leg still echoed. Thump. Drag. He had inherited the frequency he tried to master. He was now the composer of a symphony that no one would ever hear but him. A prisoner of his own genius, haunted by a ghost that had become part of his own nervous system. A week later, at 221B, Baker Street. The room was quiet, the tea was cold. And Brandon was gone, sent to the countryside to recover from the spiritual shock of the albatross. Watson was sitting in his chair, watching Holmes. Holmes was sitting by the window, his eyes fixed on the street below. He hadn't touched his violin. He hadn't taken a case. He just sat there, tuning himself back to reality. The Star of Delhi was returned to the vault, Holmes, Watson said, trying to break the heavy stillness. "The police think it was a freak electrical storm. They've closed the case." Holmes didn't turn around. "A storm of conscience, Watson. Not electricity." He held up his hand, and for a second, Watson saw a faint, violet flicker under the skin. "The frequency is gone, but the resonance remains. I can still hear them, Watson. Every echo that ever passed through that emerald, they left a part of themselves in me." Watson stood up and walked to his friend. "You saved London, Holmes. You saved us all." Holmes finally looked at him, and for a brief moment, the old spark of the great detective returned to his eyes, sharp, cold, and brilliant. "I didn't save it, Watson. I just postponed the debt. Every city has its albatross. Every soul has its song of regret. We just found the one that Moriarty chose to play." He stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, picking up a small, white feather that had been left there. A feather from the Andes. He threw it into the fireplace and watched it shrivel into nothing in the flames. "The albatross is dead, Watson. But the sky is still full of birds." He turned to the desk and picked up a fresh sheet of paper. "Now, tell me, Watson. Have you ever heard of the Mexican trucker legend? I've been hearing a new frequency, coming from across the ocean. A rhythm of wheels on a dusty road, and a scream that sounds like a horn in the fog. Close your eyes, boss, the file is closing. The London mist is turning into the dust of a desert road. Sherlock Holmes is back, but he's tuned to a different world now. The American spiritual dossier never truly ends, it just shifts its frequency. The case of the albatross is closed, but the next one is already waiting in the shadows. Sleep well, and listen to the silence. Because the silence is where the next symphony begins.